Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent McCory in for hashtag the U-What. It's Monday, May 1st. This is Africa 54. Black smoke rises over Khartoum on Monday as the United Nations warns the humanitarian crisis is turning into a full-blown catastrophe. The survivor of a Kenyan cult speaks about the group accused in the deaths of at least 100 people through extreme fasting. And we'll bring you a highlight from the Basketball Africa League's exciting weekend action. All this and much more coming up on today's Africa 54. Well, we begin in Sudan, where the warring sides in the conflict bowed to international pressure and extended a humanitarian ceasefire agreement for an additional 72 hours beginning at midnight Sunday local time. World Food Program Executive Director Cindy McCain says the UN agency is immediately lifting the temporary suspension of its operations put in place after the deaths of 3 team members on April the 15th. Meanwhile, a plume of black smoke rose over Khartoum on Monday as airstrikes and artillery fire rang out. According to Reuters, hundreds of people have been killed and thousands wounded over 16 days of battle since the disputes between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces erupted into conflict in mid-April. The United Nations warns of a humanitarian breaking point as the conflict drags on. In a recent interview with Al Hura TV, Sudan's chairman of the Transitional Sovereignty Council, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, blamed the leaders of RSF forces for the escalation.
If the issue is personal, a while back I offered Hamdan Dagalo for both of us to resign from the leadership of the Sudanese military and the Rapid Support Force and let others take the lead. He does not want to leave. He said, "You go, I want to stay," and will not go. This is the core of the problem. Hamdan wants to rule Sudan and capture the resources of the country. I have lots of proof that he wants to seize Sudan's resources, inflate his wealth, and build his own glory, at the expense of the Sudanese people, whom Hamdan is misleading about the reasons of the fighting.
Well, on the other hand, the leader of the Rapid Support Forces, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, told the Saudi Arabic language television Ashaq News on Monday that he has no objection to negotiations with the army, provided that a cessation of hostilities is respected. Now, the head of the United Nations in Sudan is reiterating his call for the warring parties in Sudan to stop fighting and engage in a genuine dialogue. Volker Perthes, who has temporarily relocated to Port Sudan due to intensified clashes in Khartoum, says he is working to engage representatives of the military and the rapid support forces to meet for the first time in a third country. He says a genuine dialogue is the only way to resolve any grievances. Perthes also says he remains in constant contact with the leaders of the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. Now, the first international cargo with medical supplies has landed in Port Sudan. It is a glimmer of hope in Sudan, where a conflict between the armed forces and a paramilitary force is putting thousands of innocent civilians at risk, including those of Sudanese children who are severely malnourished. Veronica Balderas-Iglesias reports.
With few medical supplies, Sudanese doctors have been struggling to treat more than 4,700 people who, according to Sudan's Ministry of Health, have been injured in the conflict between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. On Sunday, however, a sign of relief. 8 tons of humanitarian aid, including surgical materials, arrived in Port Sudan. Patrick Yosef is with the International Committee of the Red Cross.
I hope this will be only the first of a number of batches that will come, will be extremely crucial for the hospitals to be able to cater for the needs of thousands of people that are flocking to their doors and waiting to get medical assistance.
The conflict has also put the lives of more than 600,000 underfed Sudanese children in peril. They were already suffering from acute malnutrition before the conflict began, warned UNICEF's Chief of Field Operations in Sudan, Jill Lawler.
We know that ahead of this crisis, over 15 million people were in need of humanitarian assistance, and that included 8 million children. All the aerial bombardments, the attacks on facilities, the attacks on water infrastructure, the destruction of vital vaccine, that figure is going to go up.
The Sudanese who are dual nationals have flocked to Port Sudan, hoping to be evacuated. Professor Ali, who declined to provide his last name, told the Associated Press that he has a visa for the United Kingdom.
If you have, a foreign passport or any thing that will actually give you the chance to go outside, you will take it. And this is why everybody here is doing his best to go out of Sudan.
Many of the internally displaced, however, must rely on the generosity of strangers for accommodation and food. Wadi Halfal's resident, Naamat Jabal Sayed Hassan, bakes bread for them near the border with Egypt.
The door of our house is open. We will welcome any guests who come to us. We only hope that God will stop the wars and that both parties will agree to solve the situation.
The United Nations estimates that 75,000 people have been displaced by the fighting in Khartoum and Darfur, among other regions. Veronica Valderas Iglesias, VOA News.
Here in Washington, Sudanese demonstrators have been protesting at the White House to express their anger over the ongoing conflict. VOA's Anton Labruto reports.
Sudanese demonstrators protested at the White House over the weekend for peace in the country and what they say is inaction from the international community over the escalating conflict there.
We send in a lot of supportive petition to the whole world, and we send it to the White House, to the Congress, to our Senate. We are Sudanese, American nationality. We need them now to take action. Sudan needs help. People dying.
Others demonstrating say they came to the White House to protest the rulers of the country and that the democratic revolution against Omar al-Bashir was overshadowed by the two generals currently locked in conflict.
We want the world to know that we do not stand with neither the government nor the militia group right now. We are standing with the people. We're asking for a civilized civilian power to take over Sudan and be able to lead the youth, starting from my age and lower and younger. We have too many ideas and beautiful culture to show the world and to present to the world, but we're unable to do so. Once again, we're standing with the Medania, and we would like for the world to know that this is not what we stand for. This is not what we support. We stand for peace and no war.
Still others say that they just want the world to recognize the conflict in Sudan and how it's affecting the diaspora.
It's really important that we just keep our eyes on Sudan and just don't let it fall to the wayside.
The United States and other countries continue to evacuate citizens amid concern that the two parties could continue fighting despite the recent ceasefire extension. Anthony Labruto, VOA News, Washington.
But now for perspective on how Africa's continental and regional bodies are handling the crisis, I'm joined via Skype by Kwaku Nuama, Professor, School of International Service at American University here in Washington. Welcome, Professor Nuama.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, now the United Nations is warning that the crisis in Sudan could actually turn into a full-blown catastrophe. What would that actually mean for the entire region?
Well, you would have a spillover into countries like Chad, Central African Republic. You already have conflict in many of Sudan's 7 neighbors. So Egypt can be destabilized. You can have places like Libya, even Ethiopia being impacted negatively by this conflict. But you're also going to have a humanitarian crisis, which is a much, much bigger and more immediate concern for everybody as people begin to move across borders. And you're going to have a major security problem that can attract more mercenaries into the region. We already see the Russians in the Darfur region. You could easily end up having a bigger conflagration which engulfs many of the countries in the region who are already struggling.
And actually, Professor Nwama, for quite some time, especially the area of Darfur in Sudan had been quiet, and now we're hearing of fighting over there. And then we're seeing all these thousands of people leaving the country in all directions, to Egypt, to Chad, to South Sudan. What could happen internally also? And why do we have this great numbers of people moving out?
Well, Sudan has failed. We should admit that it has failed as a state, and as the state fails, people have to find alternative ways of surviving. You already have these conflict fault lines. So the Darfur region, we know what happened there with the Janjaweed and the genocide that occurred there. You already have clashes between Arabs and Africans in that region. As people move into that area, as Emeti's forces begin to assert control over the resources in that area, you're going to see greater pressure on the communities there to organize security on their own, since the state can no longer defend them. People are going to have to take matters to their own hands. And this is where you risk having even an ethnic aspect of this conflict come to the front.
Now, give us your assessment of how the African Union and other regional bodies have actually handled the crisis up to this point.
Well, the African Union has done its best, given the tools that it has. It's more like a severely handicapped driver being asked to control a runaway freight train, which is being tagged in various directions by regional crosswinds and an internal, polar hurricane. The organization doesn't have the tools to do this. What it can do is to keep talking to the parties, keep leveraging its relationship with other powers, other organizations like the United Nations. The United Nations has been at the forefront of some of this stuff, and the United States, to try and get the parties to keep talking, extend the ceasefire, but think about how to monitor the ceasefire, because without monitoring the ceasefire, you're not guaranteed that anybody's going to do what they said they're going to do. And then you need to start thinking about what happens after this conflict is over. So we need to bring the civilians in. And the good thing is that because none of the parties have won yet, they are more likely to listen to offers that they think can help them. So you got to start thinking about how to start using incentives, both coercive and non-coercive incentives, to try and nudge them towards a place where we can have some solution, not for now, but for the future as well.
And very quickly, talking about incentives, we've seen people protesting outside the White House. What role does the United States and other Western powers have in finding a resolution to Sudan's crisis?
The United States has a lot of influence over the parties, maybe not in Sudan itself, but the parties that are supporting the two sides. So the United States has some relationship with the Egyptians and also the Saudis and the Emiratis. The United States can help bring all those parties to the front. But in terms of even coercive incentives, the United States can start initiating efforts of the United Nations to try and indict some of these leaders. It should be on the table. When you meet with them, it shouldn't just be about asking them to make changes to their behavior on a morality basis. They're not going to do that. You have to threaten them. You have to show them the cost of not cooperating. So I would like to see some type of effort at the United Nations to indict these leaders, to talk about sanctioning them personally, so that they know that when they go ahead and they misbehave, there is going to be some consequence. The United States has the leverage to do that. Now, I would like to see the Americans come out openly and say, here's what we're going to do if you don't cooperate.
Well, we really appreciate Professor Nwama, that analysis. Kweku Nwama, he's a professor at American University School of International Service here in Washington. Now to East Africa again. Shamim Vidza is one of a small group of people who survived the self-proclaimed Good News International Church, a cult in eastern Kenya. She is recovering after being emaciated and says she joined freely, while others who joined say they are lucky to have left when they did. We get more in this report produced by Olivia Zolino.
Shamim Vidza is one of just over 30 people who survived the hunger cult in eastern Kenya.
I
went to that church because I accepted Jesus as my personal savior.
Like the others, she was discovered in the forest where the self-proclaimed Good News International Church was based. Emaciated, she was brought here to a hospital in Malindi to recover. But she still insists she was not forced to join.
Everyone has a free will to attend whatever church they want, whether you go to Ezekiel's church or wherever. No one gets promised anything. You go as a normal congregant, and I was one.
More than 100 followers of the church are known to have died so far. Japhet Sharo met the cult's leader, Patrick Mackenzie, in 1997 when they both worked as taxi operators. He says Mackenzie disappeared for a while and came back claiming to be a pastor, even recruiting Sharo into his church.
When I heard about these deaths, I was horrified. I thought to myself that if maybe I had stayed longer in that church, the same fate would have befallen me. But thank God that I and my family left in good time. I'm indeed sad because that could have been me. If indeed it is true that that is what is happening, then we leave it all to God.
Survivors say Mackenzie told them the world was going to end on April 15, and that if they starved themselves to death, they would go to heaven. He's in police custody following a tip-off earlier this month. The death toll, already one of the worst in the recent history of cult-related tragedies, is expected to rise further, as the Kenyan Red Cross says more than 300 people are missing.
Well, that's Olivia Zolino of Reuters with that report. Now, World Press Freedom Day is being marked on Wednesday. As the day gets closer, we are focusing on the state of media freedoms in Eritrea. The Horn of African country has for years ranked close to the bottom in its treatment of journalists, according to Committee to Protect Journalists. For more insight, I'm joined by VOA Senior Africa Editor Salim Solomon. Welcome to Africa 54 once again.
Thanks for having me.
So first, let's get a sense of the extent to which there has been any formal press freedom in Eritrea since it gained independence?
Well, I don't want to be the bearer of bad news, but unfortunately, the answer to that is no. You know, reporters who've been in prison since a major crackdown that took place in 2001 haven't been released, and that's why the country always lands at the last, at the bottom of world indexes that look at the press freedom in the country. And so the answer is no. And in writing, the Eritrean Constitution guarantees press freedom.
So, I mean, what really leads to the arrest and the jailing of journalists in Eritrea?
In that specific case of the reporters that were arrested and all the independent media that was shut down in 2001, the country was in the middle of a war, basically, and so that was a pretext that was used to basically crack down on independent media. So what leads to reporters being in jail is sometimes the nature in which what they report. If it's critical to the government, they are in the attention of politicians. But some of the reporters that were imprisoned, among them, wrote poets. So they were not really critical. They didn't write political writings and things like that. And so it's very unpredictable. I would say unpredictable.
It's unpredictable, and it depends on the perception of the government. Now, has there been any international efforts to have the release of those journalists who are in prison?
Yes, and that is a very good question, because most of the pressure and campaigns have come from outside the country, because it's very essentially difficult to organize or campaign or push for some sort of advocacy for those who are in jail. One example I can mention is most recently in December 2022, PEN Eritrea, which is the chapter of PEN International. It's a group of over 100 countries internationally that push for free press, freedom of speech, literature. Anyway, they got together and put together the drawings of Eritreans who have been in jail in the parliament, the British Parliament, to raise awareness. And the interview that we've done with the executive director of PEN Eritrea, he said, this is to raise awareness about their whereabouts, if they are alive, closure to their families. And so most pressure has come from exiled journalists or exiled family members who are always frustrated because they don't get answers.
Yeah, and now here we're talking about two sets of journalists also. There are those who are in prison in Eritrea, and then there are those who are forced to leave the country and they're in exile. Can you talk a little bit about those?
That is exactly where some sort of glimmer of hope is coming from in terms of getting local information in the country. Unfortunately, because there's no independent press in the country, most of the outlets, the only outlet I should say, is government controlled. And so most reporters who have been exiled have been starting these satellite TV stations. There's one in the US, one in Europe, called Asena TV, Erisat, satellite television, bringing in an alternative to what is broadcast inside the country. And there's also a radio station in France, Radio Arena. Usually these are independent radio or TV stations. They do carry a lot of like any dissent, opposition voices that you won't get inside the country. And so they broadcast back by either speaking to informants inside the country, which is the way or network of people that they've built over the years. These are reporters that have reported in the country for years and years, and so they still maintain contact, or stringers that they would find in regions to broadcast back. But that is the only glimmer of hope that you see in Eritrea that tries to fill that gap, that big gap that has been created since independence, that doesn't allow independent local media to thrive. So that's the nature in which reporters are operating at this point.
Does the government ever make, react to some of the reports about its ranking?
Yes, of course, always. They are always characterizing whatever report that comes from outside as a plot against the government. They say if you speak critically of why are these reporters in jail, or why is reporting curtailed and limited and stifled, they would say this is, external interference. And that's exactly what, major politicians, including the president of the country, have said, is that they compare reporters to spies and others to basically stifle information in the country.
Really sad. We hope someday there will be some improvement. Well, Salomon, thanks a lot for joining us. She's a VOA Africa, Senior Africa Editor. Well, still to come, Jackson Vunganya has the Basketball Africa League weekend highlights. Don't go away. In other news, Senegal's health ministry is confirming a case of Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever in a hospital on the outskirts of Dakar. The World Health Organization says Crimean Congo fever is a tick-borne virus that can also transmit between humans by close contact with blood or bodily fluids. In Nigeria, parents and a village chief say gunmen have released 74 children out of more than 80 people who were abducted earlier this month in northwestern Zamfara state. But their release comes only after ransoms were paid to parents from Wadzi Ami village by say their children are suffering from severe malnutrition. Well, and World Press Freedom Day is coming up on Wednesday, and analysts cite safety, misinformation, and online violence as the most critical threats facing African journalists. Analysts say the fact that some countries on the continent, like Mali, are no-go areas for journalists underscores the risk to media freedom. Well, now, it was an eventful weekend in Cairo as the Nile Conference of the Basketball Africa League had 4 exciting matchups. Jackson Vunganya has the highlights.
From Angola's Petro de Luanda and Mozambique's Ferroviario de Beira went head-to-head on Saturday. Down by 11 in the second quarter, Beira's Young makes a nice layup to get their deficit in single digits. Petro's largest lead in the game came in the third quarter by 18, but Beira's Gay makes a big three.
That's a great shot there.
Another big three when Petro's Majok passes to Bastos to extend their lead.
2 seconds, but still they find a way. Soaring high up into the sky, Bastos is the man.
With Petro leading most of the game, they triumphed over Beira 101-76. Egypt's El Ali went up against Uganda's Oilers for the day's second matchup. A nice start for Egypt's Omot, successful layup in the first quarter and a foul on the play.
Great drive, great score.
Up 13 in the third, Egypt's Thompson passes to Amin, who goes for a long-range three and scores to extend their lead. Al Ali's lead gets cut to 7 with under 2 minutes left when Uganda's Robert Jr. finds Jones to make a much-needed three-pointer.
Oh, three from Jones!
A close ending with Uganda down by 2 and 2 seconds left. Robert Jr. passes to Jones to Odeke, who tries for a three, but Egypt wins 72-70, getting their second victory of the Nile Conference. Sunday started with Guinea's Slack versus Mozambique's Ferroviario de Beira. Beira up early and a nice drive to the basket by Gay for 2. Down by 7 in the fourth, Slack's Irogbu makes a nice pass to Mara for a dunk to shorten Beira's lead.
Scooped in, highlight play.
Beira leading by 1 with 4 minutes left. It's a big one for Slack as Irogbu passes to Miller Jr., who scores and gets fouled, putting them in the lead. But Beira comes back as Perry gets a big three when it's needed the most.
Three again, oh my! Somebody stop that man.
5 seconds left. Numamade tries a three, but they don't need it as Beira gets their first win of the Nile Conference, beating Slack 109-97. Final matchup of the weekend, Angola's Petro de Luanda and South Africa's Cape Town Tigers. Petro ahead early in the game and Cape Town's Hall loses the ball and Angola's Moraes puts it up for Pedro for a slam dunk. Buyamba gets the ball to Majok, who finds Hollis and scores with a foul on the play, extending Petro's lead of more than 20 points right before halftime. Down by 40 points with under 5 minutes to go, the Tigers steal the ball from Afokeng, passing to Hall for 2.
Path of Hall, who makes a dunk, nicely done.
Petro dominating the game, getting a win of 87-48, resulting in their third win of the Nile Conference.
Well, and that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.